So a few other things that you should know about the greenhouse effect. As I said earlier, we haven't been at 415 to 420 parts per million CO2 for a really long time. And the Earth was a very different place the last time we had this much carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. Sea levels were higher. There were completely different creatures living on the planet. And our temperatures were almost 4 degrees higher. So one of the things that we need to know if we're trying to solve these problems is that even if we stopped producing carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases and emitting them into the atmosphere, if we stopped tomorrow, the carbon dioxide buildup wouldn't go away for at least a few hundred years. It's a slow process. So what do we do about that? Well, when we're looking at solutions, we can think about systems. So I'm going to give you another example. This is an example of a positive feedback loop. Remember, positive feedback loops are reinforcing feedback loops. Now this is on the problem side of climate change. So as the atmosphere warms, the sea ice melts. And as the sea ice melts, the oceans absorb more sunlight. They absorb more energy. And of course, the reason for this is, well, sea ice is white and the oceans are black. So black absorbs more heat energy. And so this creates its own positive feedback loop. And we've already reached a tipping point where the more the atmosphere warms, the less sea ice we have, and in turn, the more absorption of light, and that in turn warms the atmosphere. So this is a feedback loop that's going on all by itself without us contributing to it anymore, because we've already contributed to the melting of sea ice. So this is a positive feedback loop. And there are a number of feedback loops associated with climate change, things like the melting of the permafrost. That's another feedback loop because as the permafrost melts, there's a release of methane, and methane is another greenhouse gas. But let's look on the solutions side. So when we are thinking of solutions, it can be valuable to think of those solutions within terms of systems. So a systemic approach to addressing climate change could have dramatic side effects. Regenerative agriculture would not just sequester carbon in the soil, it would also make our food system more sustainable while preserving biodiversity. So one of the things that happens with monocultured crops and industrial agriculture is the soil is disturbed and the natural ecosystems within the soil are destroyed, and so those the things that those natural ecosystems do have to be replaced with chemicals. So we add in chemical fertilizer that's made from petrochemical products, and we add in pesticides and herbicides, which then leads to runoffs and other problematic effects. If we can practice regenerative agriculture, we can bring back soil diversity, and then the soil itself becomes more healthy and it stays on the ground instead of eroding as easily. The other thing that soil does is it actually sequesters carbon. Now, when it's disturbed and planted with monoculture crops, it doesn't sequester much carbon at all. But if we practice regenerative agriculture, then we can use it to sequester carbon more naturally. So when we think about solutions in terms of systems, we can often think about co-benefits. So if we do this differently, what else does that affect within the system? A good example that we had today, I think it was Andy brought up, Mass transit. Well, mass transit is a great way to reduce the impacts of fossil fuels through changing from personal car use. But what else does mass transit help us with? Well, it helps us with equality. There are a lot of people who have trouble getting around in the city because the bus schedules aren't all that effective because we don't have a lot of emphasis on mass transit. If more people use more mass transit, then we will have better mass transit and more people will be able to get around the city more effectively. We also need to think of mass transit in terms of our rural communities because we don't want to leave people behind in this transition. And right now, if you don't have a personal vehicle and you live in a rural area, you might feel quite threatened by the idea of not being able to have a personal vehicle. It can be very challenging to get around within rural areas without your own personal vehicle. But what else can be solved by having better mass transit and relying upon more ecologically friendly methods of travel? Well, if you ride your bike, you're likely to be a lot more healthy. If we have walkable communities, we're likely to be more sociable and we're likely to feel more connected to the other people within those communities. So things like physical and mental health benefits as well. So when we think of solving systemic problems with systemic solutions, we can often find these many benefits with a single solution. So when you're applying this knowledge to sustainability communication, be trying to think about how one solution benefits many things.